This exciting story begins in a palace. The prince was so beautiful that even from a distance you could tell who lived in it. There was a guy sitting in the palace with a girl. They were having a dialogue. This guy turned to the girl named Aya and said that he had recently heard that her father had adopted an orphaned boy. He also said that this boy was the son of one of his fallen knights. The girl who was sitting across from him was sipping tea, and she hesitated after hearing his words. Aya playfully looked at him and smiled and replied to His Highness that everything was correct. She explained that her father was throwing a gala banquet next week where he would be formally introduced to the aristocrats. Then His Highness looked at the table in front of them and asked if this dessert wasn't lovely. He noticed that she hadn't even tasted a single bite and was beginning to doubt that it had been cooked properly. However, the girl replied that it was all because it was almond cake. In fact, she was embarrassed to talk about it. But the prince was then suddenly very much surprised and, looking at her, asked, "Does she not like almonds?" It wasn't really about whether she liked almonds or not. She was allergic to them, and even if she told him that, the guy wouldn't listen to her. So the girl smiled and replied that she would just eat it. A little later, for she wasn't hungry now, the prince smiled back at her. She wasn't really going to tell him, because behind that harmless and sweet face was a mad tyrant. To understand this story fully, you have to go back 13 years. There was a ball at the prince's palace, and this guy showed up, but he was still very young. He pointed his finger at a little girl and said he wanted to marry her. And after 5-year-old Sign pointed his finger at her, her life became a living hell. They kept growing, and the guy bullied her, more and more every year. One day when she was 14, he brought the girl a dead bird, saying it was so loud, so Sign cut off its tongue. This crazy guy was constantly tormenting her, so Aya didn't feel comfortable and safe. And this particular girl is this crazy guy's fiancée. She's like a canary in captivity. She's dying to get away from him. Then she can live her life without worrying about anything. In fact, the girl was an ordinary office worker who works from morning to evening, and she has no time for absolutely nothing. But one day, coming home from work, she suddenly heard the voice of an agitated mother saying that a child had fallen into the sea and asking for help. Of course the girl ran, for she could swim very well. And if it hadn't been for her bravery that day, she wouldn't have died and wouldn't have gotten into this novel. Yes, she was caught up in the world she now lives in. It's a fantasy novel called Empire Moon. It's about 2 beautiful men. The girl is reborn in the body of Sign's fiancé, one of the main characters. At the age of 18, she is tragically killed by his own sword. The second main character in this novel is a boy who is about to be adopted by the girl's father. He is Uriel Godwin, her brother who is not related to the girl by blood directly. Uriel's appearance and the warmth of his soul changed Prince Sign's tyrannical behavior, completely changed to normal. And knowing the plot of the novel, the girl realized that she absolutely had to make them fall in love with each other as soon as possible. In order for the prince to break the engagement with her, only in this way she will be able to survive in this story. Some time had passed since she had been transported into the book, and one fine morning in Duke Howard's mansion, the girl was sitting by the bedside as usual. The maid was putting her hair in order, the view, and the girl was suddenly thinking about something. The maid turned to Aya in surprise and asked, "Can't she hear her?" Then the girl came to her senses as she looked at the maid. She realized that they were not alone in the room. And when she looked at the open door, she saw her mother there. She wondered if she was talking about something. Duke Howard's wife, Madame Anne, looked at the girl and asked why she was so absent-minded this day. She came closer to the girl and said that she would say it again. She would soon be dating a boy, and let her remember her words once and for all. Even if she doesn't like him and looks down on him, let her behave like a noble lady. Anne was very serious and told her daughter that such low-born nobles could not shake her noble will. She must make him grateful to them in the future. Aya listened carefully to her mother and replied in a sad voice that she understood everything and would do what she could. In fact, at this moment the day has come when she will meet her younger brother Uriel. His biological father is Lord Godwing, one of her father's knights. He died in the east in the battle for the territories of Richter's empire, defending the Duke himself. And Uriel is his only son. And in order to honorably escort one of his best knights to his final resting place, Aya's father has decided to adopt his son. And at the banquet that will take place on that very day, he will formally present him in front of all the nobles. But at that moment, a little boy suddenly ran into the room. He was dressed in his uniform and was happily addressing his sister. Aya didn't expect to see him, and afterward, with an indignant look, she asked, "Did his etiquette teacher tell him to knock first? That's rude." He was the son of Duke I Howard. He was 12 years old at the moment. The boy winked at his sister and said he understood and would be sure to knock next time. Then he, still very happy and excited, said that his father had brought this boy named Uriel. He put his arm around his sister and asked if she wanted to go with him to meet him. Aya was also excited. However, I'm very happy. She thought that this was the day when they would meet. Still, she agreed with her brother, and they set off together. When the girl was ready, they got out and headed down the halls. But the brother told his sister that, in fact, he hadn't expected her to want to join in such fun either. He admitted honestly that he actually thought she would refuse and not go to see him. Aya smiled at her younger brother and replied in a calm voice that she just thought it would be better to greet him before the ball. It would be polite of them to do so. In fact, it was said in the novel that Uriel had golden hair like the sun, and his eyes were sharp like a leopard's. He looks very handsome and awe-inspiring. Everyone present immediately falls in love with him, for such an appearance is quite rare. Aya thought at that moment that he was one of the main characters, and she was really curious about what he looked like. She thought of him as one of the main characters and wondered what he looked like. At this time, Uriel was met in the anteroom by the butler. He picked up some boxes and asked the gentleman if they were all his luggage. The boy looked at him and thought for a while. However, he looked at his things and said that he would take everything himself. This was the protagonist of the novel, Uriel Godwin. He was only 15 years old at this point. By this time, the girl and her younger brother had already reached the exit. They were met by the house staff who bowed and greeted them. Aya replied in a stern but confident voice that they were free to go and asked them not to disturb them. The servants, of course, obeyed and left at once. Then the girl knocked on the door and apologized for the disturbance. However, she didn't even have time to finish the sentence before Noah suddenly opened the door without even saying anything. He burst into the room and began scrutinizing it, asking if he was there, and wondering with anger in his voice why they were bringing all sorts of street cats and dogs into their beautiful mansion. Aya was shocked at this behavior from her younger brother. She realized that the knight had created a problem out of nowhere, and her plan to be kind and caring had failed. But then she was a little calmer when she saw Uriel. She thought he was the hero of the novel, her brother, who was not bound by blood. And as described in the novel, he was quite thin but tall. His gaze was piercing, like a grown man's. The girl thought then that it was right, for this was not the first time she had quarreled with Noah, and she had a rather calm temper. This boy is good at hiding his emotions, and he's really smart. No wonder Sin will fall in love with him. Aya continued to look at her new brother. But then the girl thought she had another chance after all. Since he wasn't angry, she decided to take it. Aya turned to Noah and told him not to be rude to strangers. After all, this was their first meeting. The girl was strict enough because she didn't want her brother to make the same mistake again. Then she, smiling, turned to their new guest and introduced herself, saying her name and that she was now his older sister. Uriel looked at them in surprise and did not say a word. Then the girl went on talking and, putting her arm around Noah, said that this was her brother, Noah Howard. She herself was worried at this point, for she had just been pissed off by her younger brother, and she really hoped she could make a good first impression on Uriel to earn her brother's love. She needs to break the engagement. Uriel was silent for a while. He thought about what was happening. After that, he smiled and introduced himself. He also told the lady and the young master that it was a pleasure to meet them. Aya realized that there was hatred behind that sweet attitude, and it was strange to her. She thought he probably didn't want anything to do with them. But the girl here suddenly said that from the moment he entered the Duke's mansion, he was no longer Godin. He was now Uriel Howard. She also said that she really hoped that they could get along and live happily ever after. Aya decided that since he didn't want to show friendliness, she would take the initiative, since she really needed it. But at that moment, Noah, who had been silent all this time, suddenly spoke. He chuckled indignantly and said that apparently he didn't really want to get along with them. He looked at Uriel with hatred and said that he was the son of a low-born knight, and their father just took pity on him. Noah, looking him straight in the eye, told him not to even hope that he could be even a small part of their family. He would always be an outsider. Aya realized that her brother was making things worse, and she couldn't calm down. She couldn't believe that the brat couldn't just keep quiet for a while and not make things worse. She thought that Uriel might well hate her after that, and she didn't know what would happen then. But then she thought that Noah was only 12 years old, and he didn't quite know what he was saying at all. Aya took her little brother by the shoulders and turned him straight to her. She looked him in the eyes and asked him to stop, because Uriel was his brother, and asked him not to say such hurtful things anymore. Noah is actually her half-brother, not her own. His mother died when he was very young, and the Duke spoiled him so much that he turned a blind eye to his antics. In the novel, Noah is the villain who was used to promote Uriel's growth. He insulted and abused the poor guy, making him feel inferior and miserable. And there was no help for Uriel in such a situation. He could only rely on his brutal character to firmly establish his status in the Duke's family. However, the girl realized that things were different now than in the past. She would have to win Uriel's favor and break the engagement. That's why she wants to help him settle into the Duke's household. Then perhaps he will be more welcoming to her. Noah suddenly became indignant at this moment. He asked his sister why she was suddenly protecting him. After all, he is her younger brother, not this stranger. The girl looked serious, and she told the boy that Uriel was now his father's son, and he must not let others think that no one respected the Duke's decision, or else he wants to make his father angry. Noah was still unhappy with everything and the situation, but he realized that it was better not to make his father angry, so he agreed. The guy turned away from them and, waving his hand, replied that this place was no fun at all, so he was leaving. Then the boy ran out the door and slammed it very hard behind him. Aya and Uriel were silent for a while. The girl spoke first. She turned to her new brother and, smiling, told him not to take offense at him, for he was still young and naive. However, Uriel suddenly looked very upset. He lowered his eyes and head down, saying that the young master was absolutely right. His status was very low, and it was only thanks to the Duke that he was able to stay off the streets. But at this moment, Aya was unwilling to listen to all of this. She took his hand and told him that it wasn't true at all. She looked him straight in the eye and replied in a confident voice that from this day forward he too was the Duke's son, no matter who said what. She supported Uriel and said so that no one would dare to hurt him in this house. She would not allow such a thing to happen. Uriel was very surprised at this reaction from the girl and didn't even know what to say to her. But she, smiling, told him not to be so surprised, for she too could call her sister just like Noah. The boy still felt awkward, but he agreed. He was silent for a while. Then, smiling, he looked at her and called her his big sister. Aya was very happy to hear this, and smiled and said that it was right, he said. Her reaction in front of him was quite secretive. However, the girl was overjoyed because the protagonist called her sister, and she is one step closer to success. But Uriel became more serious and asked why she was suddenly so nice to him. The boy really didn't understand why she was so nice to him. After all, the Duke had only set it up because of his father's death, and they shouldn't behave like that. Aya laughed at this moment and stroked his hair, sweetly calling him a fool. She explained that she was doing it because he was her little brother and she had to take care of him. The boy was very embarrassed by the situation. However, Aya also said that she wouldn't be too intrusive. However, when he needed it, she would definitely help him. In fact, the girl was very excited because she had just touched the main character's hair and felt that it was so silky. The boy was silent for a while, and afterward, calming down a little, he thanked her for it. Then Aya became more serious and said that there were indeed people in the Duke's mansion who were trying to make life difficult for him, such as Noah. If Uriel wants to stay in that place, he needs to get support. Uriel wondered for a long time who she was talking about. Then he wondered if she meant herself. The girl laughed and said not at all. After all, she is not good enough for that. However, she knew someone who could help him. The guy was immediately surprised. He didn't realize who he was talking about and asked who could help him in such a situation but her. Aya looked very serious and said that this person was Sign Chris, her fiancé. Uriel, hearing that name, immediately realized who she was talking about and asked if she really meant the fourth prince. The girl thought for a moment and said that was right. If he wanted to become stronger, he needed to make friends with the person his father and mother feared, and Sign was the perfect person for that role. However, Uriel was against such an idea and said that he didn't know the prince after all. How could he get his support? Aya winked at him and put her hand on his shoulder and told him that he didn't have to worry. He could meet him at the banquet that would be held that day. And she herself thought at that moment that the first meeting of the main characters gave her rapturous goosebumps every time she thought of it. In fact, in the novel, Uriel rescues Sane, who has been mortally wounded. Sign thanks him and accompanies him to the Duke's mansion. And since Aya knows the plot, she wants to just go with the flow and get on with the rest of the story. Aya wants Uriel to think of her as his first benefactor in this world, not Sane, who came along later. Uriel suddenly wonders what he should do in that case. At this moment, the Royal Platinum Palace was completely calm, and it also looked quite expensive. Sign sat in his office and played chess with himself, devising new strategies. The guards suddenly came to him and, turning to His Majesty, asked him when they were going to get underway. Sign replied that Duke Mitchell would be attending the Howard family's holiday banquet, and if they wanted to get into action, it would have to be before the banquet began. But then, suddenly one of his aides laughed and said that he was the fourth prince. However, his brother, the crown prince, is using him as a subordinate. It's a mockery. Sane was not hurt by these words. He looked seriously at the guard and told him to remember once and for all that it wasn't him using him, but Sane's brother. And the best outcome is a successful assassination attempt. If it fails, they'll just run away. Once again, he asked them to keep their heads down. But then, suddenly, the guard became indignant and said that if he failed, the crown prince could throw the blame on him after all. Sign continued to play chess and told him not to hesitate, because he would definitely do it. The other guard, who had been wolfing all this time, became indignant and said that it was so unfair and unconscionable after all. The Lord was already beginning to be annoyed by their doubts, and he said, raising his voice, that he should hurry too. His father and Hertz were not celebrating idiots after all. Sign, rearranging the pieces, told them that this matter was not as simple as the crown prince thought. After finishing the chess game, he stood up from the table and said that he already had a countermeasure to that. Sign suddenly began to walk away, and ending the conversation, explained that all the weapons they were using had the emblem of his knightly order carved on them. He came very close to the guard and said that since this was going to be a murder, the weapon should have no identifying marks. Then he drew the sword that hung on the guard's belt and said that if a sword with the emblem of his order was found at the scene of the crime, everyone would suspect him, of course. However, only foolish people believe in this kind of thing. Who would purposely leave such a valuable countenance? Anyone who would believe such a blatant accusation is simply a fool. The other guard hooted happily and said that he understood everything now. People will think he is a pawn of the crown prince. Everyone will think someone is trying to set him up and get him to go against Duke Mitchell. This is so that others can sit back and reap the benefits of the fisherman. His partner picked up on the thought, and smiling also said that they might suspect that the crown prince himself had done it, and threw all the blame on the fourth prince. Sign replied that either way, people would think he was some loser who had just been set up. The guards were glad that their master had come up with such a plan. That way their labors would not go to waste. As the sun began to sink below the horizon, and it grew dark outside, the guests at Duke Howard's mansion were already beginning to converge for the banquet. Aya and her new little brother were walking down the halls. She said that before the banquet started, they should switch rooms. The girl explained that Sayen would definitely come to see her, so Uriel could take the opportunity to introduce herself to him. She smiled and proudly and told him to leave the rest of it all to his sister. In fact, in the novel, Sign escapes to Aya's room after being wounded in a failed assassination attempt on Duke Mitchell. He is rescued by Uriel, who happens to be passing by, and it is through this that the boy gains the prince's sympathy. And right off the bat, you could tell that Uriel's life was much improved. At this point, the guy smiled and told his sister that he would listen to her after all. He was glad she was helping him after all. Aya stroked his head and said that was very nice of him. After that, they went on their way, each going where he needed to go. The girl went outside and stood nearby near the gazebo. She watched as the guests gradually began to arrive at the manor. Aya, upon seeing this, realized that the event was about to start very soon. However, she still couldn't see the person she was looking for. The girl stretched and decided to take a little walk to shorten the time. When she turned to the side, she looked up. There in the sky were beautiful stars and a huge moon, for the girl liked this scenery best of all. But at that moment she was suddenly interrupted from her admiration of the moon by some rustling in the bushes. She moved closer and looked out there to see who it was. The girl suggested that perhaps it might be a wild cat. And when she went inside the bushes, she saw some guy sitting under a tree. She couldn't see his face from afar because she was so shaken up. But as she got closer, she saw that this stranger was holding his hand, and she assumed that he was probably hurt. She continued to sit in the bushes and didn't understand why this situation seemed so familiar to her. But at that moment, she suddenly realized why she felt that way. She remembered all the events she had read in the novel. Aya freaked out and immediately started running away, trying to make as little noise as possible. She didn't want what she was thinking about to happen. The guy spotted her immediately and asked in a quiet voice from behind the funneling where she was suddenly running off to. The girl realized that she had been spotted, and because of that she stopped, looking back. She didn't want this situation to actually happen. The man suddenly shifted his gaze to her and asked if he couldn't see that it was her fiancé who was hurt. Aya realized that there was no way to escape, so she turned around and started laughing nervously and sighed heavily, thinking that he had noticed her after all. Then the girl came closer to him and asked him what had happened to him. The boy continued to sit under the tree holding his hand, which was bleeding. But she realized, remembering the plot of the book, that they probably never got around to killing Duke Mitchell. She was annoyed that she'd met him before Uriel. Sign looked very serious. He asked in a gruff voice that she not ask unnecessary questions, but rather help him bandage his wound. He was in a lot of pain, so he wasn't going to talk to her about the weather. Aya, turning around towards the manor, immediately said that she would be back soon, but in the meantime she would go get bandages. She thought she was going to get out of the story and get back on track. But as she was about to leave, she felt something stop her. It was her fiancé. He grabbed her hand. Essene looked her straight in the eye and asked her not to do that. He looked stern enough. Of course, she had to stay, and for a while they just stood there looking at each other, when suddenly someone's voices were heard nearby. It was the guards. They came closer and closer, and one of them told them to look for him that way, for he had seen someone running that way. Aya, hearing their voices, immediately turned in that direction. She tried to look, but she couldn't see anything because of the thick bushes. That's when the guy's voice came out. He said that if he did get caught, she would be his accomplice. It sounded like a threat. Aya was very surprised when she heard that. She certainly hadn't expected him to do such a thing, much less become an accomplice in a crime she hadn't even committed. At that moment, one of the guards suddenly saw some silhouette in the darkness and asked loudly who it was. The girl realized that she had to take matters into her own hands. She was worried sick, but pretended that everything was fine and came out of the bushes and said that it was her and asked what had happened. The guard was already approached by his partner. The man told her, as a lady, that assassins had broken into the Duke's mansion and had been ordered to search the neighborhood. Then he asked if she happened to see anyone suspicious walking by. The girl made a look of surprise and said that, in fact, she hadn't. She had just taken a walk in the neighborhood and hadn't seen anyone, so she said that they could look safely elsewhere. The guard bowed and told the lady that he understood, and also warned her that it was very dangerous outside now. So he asked her to return to the mansion as soon as possible. Aya said that she understood everything and would be back soon, and after that, waving, she gave them good luck in catching the killer. When they had gotten far enough away, the girl was finally able to exhale a sigh of relief. In fact, she had been tense the whole time, because she was worried that something would go wrong and they would be cut out. Sign, who continued to sit under the tree, suddenly laughed and said that he hadn't actually expected his little bride to know how to lie. Turns out hers used to be. And after that, in a more affectionate voice and smiling, he said that she had already grown up a lot over the years. Aya laughed nervously and said that it was probably true after all. Aya laughed nervously and said that it was probably true. However, it still shouldn't affect Sign's escape. He still has to meet Uriel for sure, and one wrong step could lead to a huge failure. At this point he suddenly spoke, interrupting the girl from her musings and asking if she happened to have a handkerchief. He also asked her to help him stop the bleeding. The girl was confused, but immediately realized that she needed to help him. Aya quickly took out her handkerchief, went around to her fiancé's other side, and started dressing his wound. This way, the bleeding finally stopped, and he didn't die of blood loss. She continued to manipulate her hand as he suddenly glimpsed her and said that she must have already guessed why she had met him in this place and what he had done. Sign said, now that she had seen and learned quite a lot, but then suddenly he didn't have time to finish because he felt a strong pain in his arm. After all, the girl had made a big mess of his wound in class. She pulled her hands away and thought about the fact that it was actually murder. Aya realized that this ruthless protagonist would really go for it, and now she considered that, being an accomplice, the girl couldn't understand if she would really have to suffer forever because of this. After all, she was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. At that moment, the groom suddenly reached up to her face to remove her hair. She immediately recoiled from him and began to shake. Scene looked at her in surprise and wondered if she was afraid of him now. The girl at that moment was surprised and thought, how could he even ask such a thing? After all, she had been living in fear since childhood, and all the dangers only happened because of him. She got a little control of her emotions and said that she had saved him anyway, so he should treat her badly now that he was on the verge of death. Messine, hearing those words, asked what he had done to her. The girl thought at that moment that the problem was that he hadn't done anything yet. Now it's all over. In fact, the guy can't stand people who put conditions on him, and in this fictional world he's the most dangerous person you could ever meet. Aya realized that she must do everything in her power. She couldn't make any mistakes. Then the girl suddenly fell to the ground and began to worship him, telling His Highness that she wouldn't dare to behave like that anymore. So she really begged him to let her go already at last. Aya looked with tears in her eyes at his face, promised that she would keep quiet. Not even that. She'd pretend she didn't know anything and hadn't even seen him that evening. She'll tell everyone that she was just walking around the garden all alone and didn't see anything suspicious. Sane, seeing how frightened she was surprised. He didn't say anything because he didn't expect her to react like that. Aya, after calming down a bit, told His Highness that she had worked hard all these years to wait for a bride who was worthy of him, and asked that he give her one more chance. Sine couldn't understand the girl's reaction, and then suddenly asked if she really thought he was capable of killing her. In fact, according to him, it was more like his fiancée had become some kind of servant. However, it was okay as long as it didn't threaten the girl's life. Aya moved closer to him and plunged into his arms, saying in a quiet voice that she would obey him for sure. And at that moment, she thought she had no other choice, because if she obeyed him, it would be the end of her. By that time, they had cleared everything up, and the girl was the first to return to the manor. She was met by the maid, who was excited and asked her mistress where she had gone, because she was so worried about her. The maid kept her mistress from saying a word, saying that the ducal family was looking for her and was very worried, Sir Urielum. She came into the room several times, and he was still waiting for her. It was a maid named Messa. She was really worried about the mistress, since she had only worked with her all the time. Aya ignored her words and thought about Uriel waiting for Sine on her advice. However, the guy never came. Once again, the storyline has been disrupted, and what she'd come up with didn't add up the way she wanted it to. Then the girl suddenly looked to the side and saw Uriel suddenly come in. The guy ran out to meet her and hugged her happily, asking if she was okay, because he was so worried about her. She left without saying a word and disappeared somewhere for so long. Aya was shocked at such a gesture of attention from a guy, coming again her so hard she couldn't even breathe properly. She gave him a sign, and Uriel let her go. Then the girl hugged him back and told him that she was absolutely fine. She had just gone for a walk and happened to be where they were looking for the murderer. The guy let go and looked her straight in the eye, told her not to go out on her own at any time next time, and let him stay with her to protect her. Aya smiled and said that it was actually her fault. In the future, she would be more careful and make sure to tell where she was going. It was just the way things were. And she herself at this moment thought that since he is the main character, his behavior is very different from Sine, and Uriel has a soft character, like a warm spring breeze, and Sine in turn like a rabid dog. Then Uriel smiled and said that since she was fine, he would go back to his room and told his sister to rest. The girl smiled back at him and told him to go to bed early too, because he had to be ready for tomorrow. The girl smiled back at him and told him to go to bed early too, because he had to be ready for tomorrow. He didn't understand what she meant, and then he asked, was there really going to be something very important? In fact, further into the story, the king tasks the third prince and heir to track down the real killer. The crown prince refuses to participate in the quest and sends Sine, the third prince, the grandson of Duke Caesar, to the place. So he goes to have an audience with his elders. And just like that, in the process, all the blame would fall on the fourth prince. And if you think about it, even if Uriel couldn't meet Sign that day. Though the next day he would come to investigate the case where they could get acquainted, so the girl was quite calm about it. She realized that tomorrow would be a very hard day. However, for the sake of her brother's love, she had to work hard, so Aya was quite serious. She needed to make things right. At this time in his duchy, the son was having breakfast the next day. Outside the window, the weather was just fine, quite warm, and the sun was shining even. After he finished all his business at the estate, he arrived just at Howard's duchy. He went in, and drinking tea, told him that he had come to collect evidence he thought the man already knew the truth. The crown prince asked him to convey that if their family did not want to be destroyed, they should follow the decree. Duke Howard was not surprised. He replied to His Highness the Crown Prince in a calm voice that he didn't have to worry about it, because they would always support him both now and in the future. Xian, finishing his tea, said he was done in that case, getting up from the table. The Duke asked if he would mind if he checked on his fiancée. However, the Duke certainly didn't mind. He smiled and said that, in fact, he thought his daughter would be happy to see him. At this moment, he thought that the future of the ducal family lies in Aya's hands. He really wants her to support the fourth prince in order to please the future king. At this very time, the girl had guests in her room. It was her fiancé and her new brother. They were just waiting for Sign. Uriel watched the girl in surprise, for she had been walking all this time because of her strong nerves and could not even sit and wait quietly. After the 10th lap, he couldn't stand it anymore and asked if she was dizzy by any chance. She was already on her feet and asked if something was bothering her. The girl looked back at him in surprise and said that of course she was, because it was the most important event in his life. But Uriel didn't understand why she was so worried. Aya explained that what she really meant was that her main task was to introduce him to the fourth prince, and she would definitely help him become a royal knight. However, the guy continued to be surprised and asked how on earth she knew that he specifically wanted to become a royal knight, since he hadn't told anyone about it before. The girl realized at this point that she had blabbed a lot of unnecessary things, for because of her turmoil, she had accidentally let slip. She shouldn't have given herself away, but she knew what she knew. Aya was silent for a while, and then, trying to get out of the situation, she said that, in fact, she thought that since his father was a knight, he too would want to follow in his footsteps and become a royal knight. Uriel was silent for a while. Afterwards, smiling, she said that she was very kind. No one but she was so willing to understand and help him. He looked her straight in the eyes and let out a small smile, saying that he didn't really know what he should do, but she had accepted him, so he wanted to repay her. The girl thought at that moment that everything must be going right after all, as long as he was grateful to her. But at that moment, their conversation was interrupted by a maid who ran into their room. She turned to the lady and my lord, saying that the prince had already left the duke's study. Aya surprisingly looked calm and said that it was very good. After that, she turned to her brother. The girl took his hand and told Uriel that she would take him to the crown prince. He had nothing to worry about. She began to pull him quickly by the arm toward the exit, and Uriel, who could barely keep up with her speed, asked her to slow down. But the girl objected and said that if they were slow, the prince might even leave. In fact, she was very happy that the heroes were finally going to see each other, and she should definitely facilitate their meeting again, since things hadn't worked out so well in the previous one. At that time, he found some flowers somewhere and was already walking towards his future wife. He looked confident, but he was still a little worried. His guards who were escorting suggested that, in order to please the young lady, he should give her flowers because it would be a very nice gesture. And when he had already picked flowers and passed by them, the guards suddenly saw the expression on his face. However, they didn't understand what it was. This had never happened before. One of them suggested that the guy was probably just happy. At this time, a girl had already come out to meet them, and when she saw His Highness, she called out to him excitedly. She was very surprised that he was even coming to meet them. However, the girl was not confused and said hello to him. Sign saw her and called her name excitedly. He was about to give her flowers when he noticed that she was holding some guy's hand. The man got very angry because of this and, becoming quite serious, asked in a gruff voice who the person next to her was. Aya didn't seem to notice his rude reaction, and, smiling, told His Highness that it was very good that they had met. Then she pointed to her brother and said that this was Uriel. She wanted to introduce him to him. Uriel bowed, and after greeting His Highness the fourth prince, he also gave his name as a courtesy. However, at this very time, he began to scrutinize him, marveling at the fact that he was Aya's fiancé. But as expected from a member of the royal family, the body exuded an unapproachable grandeur. Sign was still wary. He asked the girl, "Is this really the boy her father adopted?" However, thought at this moment, this guy had only been in the mansion for 1 day. However, in that time he was able to get so close to Aya, because even he hadn't held her hand for that long. The girl suddenly turned to His Highness and asked about the flowers he was holding. The guy, who was seized with jealousy at the time, immediately woke up. He remembered about the flowers he wanted to give her, and he even felt kind of embarrassed. However, he realized that he had to get out of the situation. He handed the girl the flowers and said that they were flowers he had picked by accident in their garden. The boy was so embarrassed that he even blushed. However, Aya didn't pay attention to all of that. She was genuinely surprised that they had such beautiful flowers in their garden. After all, she hadn't seen them before. Sane handed the flowers to her with all sorts of indifference, saying they were ugly anyway, and turned away to avoid looking her in the eye. He was too embarrassed. The girl was a little surprised. However, she smiled and apologized for making him laugh. However, one thing she didn't understand was why he was giving them to her since they were ugly. She just didn't have the words. Uriel, who had been standing next to them the whole time, silently didn't understand what was even going on between them. He couldn't believe that the fourth prince always spoke to his sister like that. It was very rude of him. He didn't understand how he could bully a fragile girl like Aya, and at this moment his fist even clenched from anger. At that moment, Sign spoke again. He said that he actually came to say that the murderer was a girl. Surprised, she asked, "Is that really true?" However, it is very good. Aya actually realized at this moment that he had most likely found a scapegoat during this time. However, she couldn't believe that he had come to warn her. But as expected from a crazy, scheming novelist, he is worried about her, even though she had only made him a promise yesterday. Sen, turning away from her, said that it was actually her father who had caught the killer and would soon reward him. The girl hesitated at this point and assumed that it was probably done to pay tribute to the Howard family. Still, however, the news surprised her. She couldn't understand why her fiancé had suddenly become so kind. Aya realized she had to act, and when the boy started to leave, she grabbed his sleeve and gestured for him to stop. Sane didn't really like the way she did it and turned around with an annoyed expression, asking, "What's wrong?" Aya was still holding the flowers in her hands. She turned to him, smiling, and asked him if he wanted to stay a little longer at the manor. The girl was very worried, but she still tried to keep her emotions in check. She thought at that moment that he couldn't just leave. He hadn't met Uriel yet, and a first meeting couldn't just end like that, not on such a harsh note between them. Sane looked at the girl in surprise and asked why he should stay. She thought for a while and then said that it was because she didn't want him to leave right away. In fact, for the sake of the two main characters, she has to risk so much. But still, she simply has no other choice. She has to make these two fall in love with each other and live happily ever after, and she doesn't die. Sign listened to his future wife and agreed to stay. They moved to the gazebo, for the heat had died down in the evening, and they could sit in the light spring breeze and enjoy the weather. They sat in the gazebo and just looked at each other. However, the girl didn't understand why it had all turned into what felt like a triple date. There was such silence, and she thought that the protagonist could use something to say. They were silent for a while longer. Then the girl realized that she had to take the initiative. She cleared her throat and told His Highness that Uriel was indeed a very good boy. Scene then suddenly looked at her in surprise and asked if he was okay at all. Aya was very surprised to hear such a question. However, the guy did not understand why this woman, who was to marry him soon, was praising other men when he was sitting right next to her. However, the girl, with a smile on her face and as if nothing had happened, continued talking. She told His Highness that Uriel was very talented at swordsmanship, and perhaps he might even find it useful in the future and even like it. At this point, Scene couldn't stand this insolence any longer. He suddenly started screaming and asked her to stop already. After calming down a little and seeing the girl's frightened face, he turned to her and asked her who she thought she was in general, or whether she thought she had sufficient qualities to recommend people to him. In fact, he thought she had asked him to stay to socialize with him and have a good time. However, it turned out that she was only doing all this for her brother. Uriel, who had been sitting in silence all this time, suddenly became angry. He turned to His Majesty and said that he had actually made his sister angry. The man looked very serious and angry. In fact, the guy at this moment thought that if he did become a knight, he would protect his sister in the future. Aya, who was sitting between them, thought that this was the time for that second dialogue between the main characters, but she didn't understand why it was so different from how she had envisioned it. At that moment, Sign was no longer going to endure all this humiliation. He got up from the table and said he was going back. The girl immediately followed him up from the table and ran to catch up with him. She asked His Highness to wait, for that was not what she had in mind at all. She even grabbed his hand and explained that she really just wanted him to meet her brother because he was really cute. But the guy took her hand away and asked her to leave him alone. She thought she must be crazy to have fallen for his sweet side. Scene yanked his arm so hard that the girl couldn't even stand on her feet and started to fall. Uriel, of course, managed to quickly run up and grabbed her halfway down. He was very worried about the girl's condition. When the guy had already caught his sister, he turned to shout at His Highness and said that Aya was actually his fiancée. I don't understand how he can abuse her like that at all. He thought at that moment that, in fact, it was all his fault. After all, if it wasn't for his precarious position in society, the girl wouldn't have to behave like this in front of the prince. He must become stronger in order to protect Aya. Sign at this point turned to look at the two of them, to look at his interlocutor. However, he saw her brother holding the girl by the shoulders. That was close enough. He sighed heavily, and after thinking for a while, he spoke. Sign replied to Aya with incredible anger that so be it. He had gotten to know her this day much more intimately than he had before. In fact, he hadn't even expected that this girl could become like this when she grew up. This came as an unpleasant surprise to him. The guy was so angry, he even thought he should have locked her up in the palace so she couldn't see anyone but him alone. He turned around and started to walk away, as he had had enough of this. But Uriel suddenly shouted back at him to stop and listen to him. Aya, who had been standing silently all this time, thought that, in fact, she was actually trying to bring him closer to his own love interest. At that moment, she covered her face with her hands, because she was too uncomfortable with the whole situation. Uriel put his arm around her and told her not to cry. Even without the help of the fourth prince, he would be a strong knight who could protect her. The girl actually realized that everything was now completely screwed up and the plot was completely broken. At that moment, she suddenly began to have a severe headache, and her eyelids suddenly felt so heavy that she couldn't even keep her eyes open. At that moment, she felt something very bad, and the girl lost consciousness, falling straight into her brother's arms. And so, while the girl was unconscious, she remembered a moment in history of how she was kept locked up. Aya turned to His Highness and begged them to let her go. She screamed the whole time and tearfully claimed that she would never dare interfere with Uriel ever again. Sane looked at the girl with incredible hatred and said that she dare not even say his name out loud, for a very filthy creature like her should not even think of Uriel. Aya looked at the two of them in surprise and didn't understand why things were happening this way. She realized that it was useless to ask His Highness. So she turned to Uriel and asked him to at least listen to her. After all, when he was in a pitiful state, her family had brought him home. She took hold of his pant leg, out of the pity in her voice, asking for him to save her. The guy didn't answer anything. He just smiled. Afterward, he sat down beside her and asked her if by any chance someone had told her that she was unworthy of a petition, and he really liked her desperate face. He looked the girl straight in the eyes and then turned to his lover and told Sign to kill her at last. He, of course, agreed and in a second drew his sword and slit the girl's throat. She immediately died on the spot before she could even say a single word. And so, after Aya had felt death on herself, she opened her eyes. The girl was terrified. After all, this dream was scary enough, considering that she had died in it. Looking around, the girl calmed down a bit. After all, she realized that she was alive and well now, in bed. Aya looked around and recognized it as her room. The girl assumed that she was probably just having a nightmare, but at that moment she suddenly felt some kind of heaviness on her arm. And when she shifted her gaze, she saw that someone was holding her hand. When Aya looked away, she saw that Uriel was lying next to her asleep, holding her hand. She was surprised to see this, for she had not thought he would be with her. Then the guy suddenly started waking up little by little and looked at the girl, and Aya also looked straight into his eyes for a while. Afterward, however, the girl sat up abruptly on the bed, taking her hand away from his, and asked Uriel in wonder why he was sleeping next to her. Uriel paid no attention to her surprise. He shouted out happily, calling the girl's name and saying that she was finally awake already. The guy also explained that she had been unconscious for almost 2 days. The girl was very surprised to hear this. She asked if she had really fainted, for she could not remember anything at all. Uriel began to explain everything to her, saying that the day they met the prince, she had fainted right in front of him, and he was very afraid for her health. Aya slowly began to remember the events of that day, and said that it was probably because she was very nervous. Uriel didn't say a word. He began to move closer and closer to the girl. She tried to pull away as far as she could, and asked in surprise what he wanted to do now. But the guy didn't answer anything to that. He just kept coming closer to the girl's face, and then he touched his forehead to hers and closed his eyes. Aya was incredibly surprised. She didn't understand her brother's reaction. However, after a while he suddenly pulled back and said in a cheerful voice that her forehead was no longer hot, and the fever must be subsiding. When the girl heard these words, she exhaled with relief, for she had already thought that just now something might have happened that should absolutely not happen between brother and sister. Actually, he just wanted to check her temperature to see if she had a fever. She'd already thought she was going to kiss her. At that moment, the Duke and Duchess came into the room, and her little brother Noah flew in as well. They were all overjoyed, and the mistress said they had been frantically worried while she was unconscious. The mother immediately approached her daughter and asked how she was feeling, if she had any discomfort, while the girl's brother and father stood by, preparing to express their emotions. The Duke, in turn, turned to Uriel and said that he had been together with the girl for a whole night, so he should go and get some rest. The boy agreed, and Aya, hearing those words, was very surprised. She didn't expect him to be by her side for a whole night. She thought about how insanely sweet that was of Uriel, and could barely contain her emotions. As Uriel started to leave, he suddenly said that he was certainly very kind to his sister, but it was still completely unknown whether it was all sincere. Aya was displeased with this behavior of her younger brother, and asked if he thought that absolutely everyone was bad for him. Even he was better at taking care of the girl than the fourth prince who just ignored her. But there was no answer to that. He crooked his face and just kept silent. The girl at that moment thought that this child's behavior was really terrible. Then the Duke spoke up and said that actually the fourth prince was currently engaged in an errand for the king, and where could he possibly have time to take care of the girl? Aya replied in an indignant voice that if her husband would not love and care for her, then how could she marry him? Then Noah intervened in their conversation and said in a serious tone that if she didn't like it, just let her break off her engagement. She thought at that moment that her brother had finally said something intelligent. But at that moment, the Duchess suddenly looked angrily at Noah and said that children dare not say such things, for her sister's engagement was a marriage granted by the royal family. She also said that after the Queen's death, it was now taboo to talk about it, and asked who would dare to ask for the engagement to be broken off at all anymore. But she didn't like those moments when he was made to look wrong, so he just kept silent and sighed heavily. The Duke turned to his daughter and told her that her engagement to the fourth prince was a foregone conclusion. He follows the crown prince, so only she will be able to protect their family in the future, so she will always have to stay at his side, no matter what happens there. The Duchess stroked her daughter's cheek and said that in general she should not listen to her brother's nonsense, and further establish a good relationship with the fourth prince. Aya replied that she understood. At this moment, she thought that her efforts were completely useless anyway, because she and Sign wouldn't get married in the future. Then the Duke came closer and said that it would not be long before her grandfather's birthday. He had never liked her brother, but his possession and title must be inherited. He also said that he had heard that this banquet was being held to choose the future heir to the throne. He looked his daughter straight in the eye and said that she should take care of herself and help her brother when the time was right. In fact, Grandpa's birthday is a fairly important chapter in the original novel, as far as she could remember at all. Uriel and Engels Howard, her older brother, will oppose each other for Grandpa's favor. Uriel defeated Engels in a single game of chess, by which he became famous among all the aristocrats, and subsequently received the favor of his grandfather. But more importantly, this battle allowed Sign, a chess-playing fanatic, to appreciate Uriel and let him even closer. Aya, remembering all these important moments, realized that there was still such a crucial and important moment in the novel, so she would have to take advantage of it. The girl was overjoyed because she would find a way to unite them. Then she turned to her mother and father and said that they could rest assured that she would soon recover and be absolutely ready for the banquet, so they certainly need not worry about it. And she herself at that moment thought she could witness the historic moment when the main characters became close after a game of chess. Some time had passed since then, and Aya met her brother Uriel. When he heard her request, he thought for a moment. Then the girl said that very soon it would be grandfather's birthday and they should get his favor. She also said that they just have to beat the rest of the family in chess. But Uriel, hearing these words, objected and told his sister that he was not very good at chess. She thought at that moment that not at all. He was underestimating himself, because in the real plot of the novel, he was even able to beat his son, who is a crazy fan of this game, and he could even be considered a professional. So the girl turned to him and said that he certainly did not underestimate himself, so she offered to play him one game and check what he is still capable of. The guy was uncomfortable because he really thought he was very bad at chess. However, he still agreed to it, and the girl at that moment thought that losing to the person who had beaten Sane would not be at all embarrassing, like losing to a beginner. Soon the maid brought chess for them, and brother and sister began their duel, the pieces shifting, and some even leaving the field of battle. Soon the game was finally over, but Aya was shocked, because everything did not happen as she expected and she was able to win the game. The girl was surprised and asked how this could have happened. Uriel was very embarrassed and ashamed about the situation, so he lowered his gaze and apologized to his sister for disappointing her. The girl in turn looked at him in surprise and wondered if he had given in to her on purpose. She still couldn't believe that she had won the game. In fact, in the novel, he had defeated even the girl, so Sign recognized his abilities. However, she still couldn't understand how Ellie could lose to her, this man who very rarely played chess and had almost no skill. Uriel put his hand on his heart and said that his older sister was simply excellent at chess, and he was even willing to bow to her incredible abilities. Aya, upon hearing this, was astonished. However, the guy at this moment thought that, in fact, as one would expect from her. The girl is good at everything, and being her brother is probably the greatest honor for him. Then the girl stood up and moved closer to him and slammed her hands on the table. She turned to Uriel and said that he must win the chess game at the next banquet, the only way to get his grandfather's support. In fact, Saini would change because of him, and so they would even become best friends in the future. But Uriel objected and said that in fact it was impossible to improve his chess skills in 2 days. But the girl insisted on her own and told him to put all those horrible thoughts aside and told him that he would definitely be able to do it. He would just have to try a little harder and make a little more effort. She thought about the fact that he was the protagonist of the novel after all, so he would be able to do absolutely anything. Aya said that she would arrange special training for him, so he wouldn't have to worry. He would be able to learn everything in time. And so a few days had passed since then, and finally their grandfather's birthday arrived. The guests began to gather at the old Duke's mansion to congratulate him. Soon, Aya's family's carriage pulled up as well. Uriel got out first and helped her out. The girl was dressed in an incredibly luxurious dress, for it was a momentous occasion after all. As soon as she came down, she immediately thanked her brother for being so kind, for he had helped her do it. However, the Duke and Duchess looked at them in surprise, not understanding why they were suddenly being so nice. Noah also noticed this. He angrily turned to his father and said that, in fact, Uriel had kidnapped his older sister, and he didn't like it at all. The Duke was surprised at his son's words and told him not to talk nonsense, because his sister was treating him like a servant. He leaned over to Noah and said that he and Aya were real blood relatives, so the boy had nothing to worry about. However, the Duchess, observing all this, said that not at all, for Aya and Engels are real brother and sister. When Noah heard this, he looked at his mother irritably. He didn't understand why she had suddenly become so rude. The Duke turned to his wife at this point and told her not to talk about the children, and they were still one family. The wife sighed heavily but still agreed with his thoughts. At this moment, Engels Howard suddenly walked out to them. He was 18 years old at this point. He turned to his father and mother and greeted them cheerfully. Mom immediately went over to him and hugged him, asking why he was out. "Aren't the knights busy?" The boy replied that they were. However, the Crown Prince personally contacted his commander and he was released. Engels smiled and said that, so as not to waste any time, he was immediately cut down by the prince and went straight to his grandfather. His father also approached him and smiled modestly and said that he was also glad that he had come. "I guess the work in the royal order is quite hard," and asked him if he was tired a lot during this time. Engels replied to his father that he shouldn't worry. He was fine and not overburdening himself too much. He looked around but suddenly asked in surprise where Aya was. The Duchess pointed toward her daughter and said she was with the child his father had brought. It was his grandfather's birthday this day, so she asked that the lad not to get too close to this boy in front of strangers. He has a rather low status. Engels obeyed his mother, but he still wanted to say hello to his little sister, so he came closer and called her name. Aya, hearing a familiar voice, immediately turned around and shouted out happily that it was her older brother. She was really happy to see him, because he had gone to study with the knights and hadn't been home for a long time. Engels, in turn, turned to Uriel and said that he was the son of a knight, and his father had been very kind to adopt them. He said in a gruff voice that the lad should be grateful to them and not hang around the girl. Uriel was about to say something in his defense, but Aya turned indignantly to Engels and told him to shut up. She defended her younger brother and asked him why he was suddenly so angry. It was the first time they had met, and they didn't even know each other. The girl also explained that Uriel was not hitting on her, but that she liked having him around. Engels was surprised to hear this. He took a closer look at the guy behind his sister and didn't understand how she could like him. Engels is actually one of the characters the girl hates the most. Even though he is very kind to Aya and spoils her all the time, he still has too high an opinion of himself. He treats people like useless garbage who have no rights and just have to obey. Of course, he is particularly fond of beautiful women, and this can be said to be his weakness. But he still acts arrogant even with them. Engels turned to her and said that he didn't understand how she could even argue with him. After all, he was saying it for her own good. Aya was outraged when she heard this and said he should respect her opinion and not point fingers at others for her so-called good. The brother realized that he might have a fight with his sister now and said that it was all his fault, asking that the girl not get angry on such a beautiful day. At that moment, another carriage arrived and a young man got out of it. He immediately approached the three who were standing aside. Of course, it was Sign and his entourage. The guy, as soon as he approached, immediately turned to Aya Howard and asked if she had a cold, why she was wearing such a warm cloak. Some time had passed since then, and everyone had already come inside to celebrate the birthday. For the moment, there was a confrontation between Sign and the old Duke at chess. The boy turned to the Duke and said that he had less than 10 moves left and would lose. However, the Duke, who was wise enough, said that the outcome of the game could not be clear yet. Soon the whole family came into the room. They said hello to Grandpa and were very happy to see him. Aya, when she looked towards her grandfather's opponent, saw her fiancé. She didn't understand why he had suddenly arrived so early. Then Noah was the first to speak. He joyfully turned to his grandfather and wished him a happy birthday. After that, Engels spoke and also congratulated him, saying that he had prepared a present for him, and the lad really hoped his grandfather would like it. The Duke replied that it was good. He received their wishes and asked that they go to the banqueting hall and wait for him, for he had rather important business to discuss with His Highness.